Good morning and welcome to today's webinar by Field Fisher and Gardner Law. Before we begin, I would like to point out that this webinar will be recorded. You will, however, not be heard or seen at any time. Questions are, of course, more than welcome. If you would like to ask a question, just type it into the question pane on your control panel. The presentation as well as the recording will be sent to you after the webinar. Now I'll hand over to our panelists, Amanda Johnston, Bryn Stanley, and Kurt Wilhelm.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join us for a regulatory update. The first portion of today's webinar is going to be from Gardner Law. So myself, Amanda Johnston, and Bryn Stanley are going to be talking about a very current topic on everybody's mind is the COVID-19 pandemic. And from that pandemic, we've seen kind of a flurry of FDA activity as it relates to emergency use authorizations. And then afterwards, I'll hand it over to Cord to talk about EU MDR. All right, just quickly, again, my name is Amanda Johnston. I'm a senior attorney at Gardner Law. Been in the medical device and healthcare industry for a little over 9 years. And Bryn, if you want to introduce yourself quickly, and then we'll pass it over to you after in a few minutes.
I'm Bryn Stanley, and I'm an associate attorney at Gardner Law. I'm a former quality engineer, and I've been in the healthcare industry for 15 plus years.
Great, thanks. So Gardner Law, just a little brief overview. We are a kind of boutique, smaller firm located in Stillwater, Minnesota. And we focus primarily on the med tech industry, so FDA regulated companies. We provide FDA assistance, submissions, regulatory assessments, help with EUAs, but also help on the healthcare fraud and abuse side of it. So setting up compliance programs, helping with compliance questions, kind of anything really that an FDA regulated company would need help with. So just wanted to point out that we have our emails on there and phone numbers. If you have any questions that you want to reach out to us after this webinar, we'd be happy to help you with that. All right, so today we're going to talk again about the FDA's Emergency Use Authorization Authority. So of course, we'll talk about preparing and submitting EUA requests. We'll talk about kind of the plethora of guidance documents and policies that FDA has issued since March. They've been very busy. And then Bryn will talk a little bit about the QMS considerations that come along with EUA processes and the guidance documents. We'll touch on enforcement trends, so kind of recent occurrences around FDA enforcing these policies and guidances related to COVID-19. We'll also talk briefly about the PrEP Act and the CARES Act, which are related to public health emergency activities. We'll talk about key takeaways, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. But again, as was noted in the beginning, if you do have a question, during the presentation, feel free to type it into the question box. And hopefully you can feel free to interrupt us with any questions. All right, so just an overview on FDA's EUA authority. So FDA actually has the authority to issue EUAs, and that's triggered only when the following determinations are made. So first of all, there has to be a public health emergency declaration. And this is from the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. And so they make the determination that a public health emergency exists. And then they must also make a secondary declaration that the circumstances exist because of the public health emergency that justifies the FDA being able to issue EUAs. And there's also additional criteria for EUAs that we'll talk about. But it's important to note that both of these declarations have been initiated. I believe the first one was in February, and the EUA declaration was very shortly after. And they are renewed every 90 days. So once the EUA authority is triggered, the FDA commissioner can issue, and this is kind of just the wordy definition of when an EUA may be issued. They refer to the products to treat or diagnose or prevent as medical countermeasures, or MCM. So they allow MCMs to be used in a public health emergency to treat, prevent, or diagnose, and then they have either chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear, so CBRN agents and that includes infectious disease threats. And so that is how COVID-19 kind of met the criteria for issuing an EUA declaration. And then the important part there at the end is when there are no adequate, approved, and available alternatives, and we'll talk about that shortly. But it's important to note that this is also very separate and distinct from investigational applications. So it's different from an IDE, it's different from an IND. They're just separately, they're regulated separately. But we've seen some interesting circumstances when a company has an IDE or has an IND and then also has an EUA. So just interesting to see how those kind of correlate and how you treat your IDE device versus your EUA device. So you can imagine that brings up some interesting regulatory questions. So here is kind of the 4 big criteria that FDA really evaluates EUAs under. So the criteria is, number 1, it has to be a serious or life-threatening condition or disease. And we know that COVID-19 meets that criteria because the Secretary of DHHS has declared that. There has to be some evidence of effectiveness. And the threshold is lower, understandably, under the emergency use procedures. And they use the may be effective standard. So that's a little different than the actual effectiveness standard that they would use for a product approval or clearance. And then there has to be a risk-benefit analysis. So really, FDA analyzes the risks and the benefits, and they have to essentially determine that the risks would outweigh the benefits. And they look at kind of a totality of the scientific evidence. And then the no alternatives piece is big. So in order to find that there's no alternatives, there has to be no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. It's important to note that insufficient supply, so we're having shortages on PPE and masks and gowns and gloves. So that is considered unavailable, or it's not considered an available alternative. And so that's where I think we're seeing a lot of the activity around PPE, ventilators. So they have identified that we don't have available alternatives, even though we have them cleared or approved, there's an insufficient supply. All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit about kind of the actual EUAs, so like what FDA is actually issuing and what they're allowing. It's actually kind of a confusing patchwork of documentation that we've issued over the last 6 months or so, and it's been constantly evolving. So I just want to be clear that what we're saying today, we tried to keep it pretty high level because we understand that it is an evolving situation. And we're not going to go into depth on certain EUAs because it changes so often. So of course, if you have questions that come up that relate to an EUA that we talked about, consult with your regulatory, your legal, your compliance department, or an external consultant if you have questions about very specific EUAs and what is currently effective. So there's individual EUAs. So under this, the manufacturer proactively submits an EUA request to the FDA, really meeting those 4 criteria that we talk about. That's kind of the body of the EUA request. And then FDA will authorize or not authorize that individual product. And you will see these are all listed on FDA's website once they are authorized. And then there's something that they've come to call an umbrella EUA. And so that is where FDA issues a general EUA on a product category that outlines certain criteria and steps to follow in order to be authorized under the EUA. So just have a couple examples up here. So under the first example, FDA will submit an umbrella EUA outlining steps for submission. And then the company submits the EUA, in compliance with the EUA as FDA issued it. And then they'll be added to an Appendix A, is what they're calling it. And I think it's Appendix A for all of the EUAs that have this. But one example is there was a surgical mask EUA that was recently issued, in August. And so they have an Appendix A now that surgical masks can submit the data, and if they're authorized, they're added to that list. And then there's also umbrella EUAs for the non-NIOSH approved filtering face piece respirators. So that's another example where you're following FDA's EUA, but you're again submitting, and then FDA has to authorize you in order to be on the Appendix A. And then the other example is just a kind of there's another couple EUAs that are FDA issues it, and if you meet the requirements, they consider you to be authorized. There isn't that submission and authorization and Appendix A requirement. So a face shield, there's a face shields EUA, there's a gowns and other apparel EUA. And I'm guessing it's because these are just lower risk devices and FDA is trying to prioritize how they want to utilize their time and efforts in reviewing. So you can see it gets quickly complicated because there's overlapping individual EUAs and umbrella EUAs, and then we'll talk about enforcement policies and temporary policies. So it can get complicated pretty quickly. All right, so just wanted to talk a little bit about current EUAs, and this was as of earlier this week. I haven't checked today yet, but they are issuing EUAs daily. So these are the big categories of EUAs that FDA keeps track of. In vitro diagnostic products, so these are products that either diagnose or detect SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, or diagnoses COVID-19. And FDA has issued 288 EUAs under this product category, that's crazy to think about. And there are templates for some of these EUA submissions. So if you have a product that is intended to detect or diagnose COVID-19, I encourage you to go on the website, look for the current version of the template, figure out what template you should be using, and then use that. And then individual products under these EUAs are authorized by the FDA through a letter of authorization or an LOA, and those are publicly available on FDA's website. And then the next kind of category of EUAs is PPE, so personal protective equipment. There's umbrella EUAs that we talked about on the last slide, so the surgical masks, gowns, face shields. But then there's also individual products that the manufacturer, proactively submits an EUA request because it probably isn't covered by an existing umbrella EUA or a broader EUA, and then they've issued authorizations via LOAs, and there's been 22 of those. The third category is ventilators and similar medical devices. So there's been 26 of these. Again, there's templates for these EUA submissions. So make sure you're going on the website if you're thinking about submitting an EUA for really any of these product categories. And then individual products are authorized via the LOA process. And I thought it was interesting that there's only been 5 EUAs for drug and biological products. And so we've heard about some of these on the news. Remdesivir is one that has been authorized under this category, but this is a individual product authorization. So you actually have to fill out, submit an EUA request, and FDA has to authorize it. The convalescent plasma is another one. The hydroxychloroquine was under this EUA, or under this category of EUAs. It was revoked. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But just interesting that there's only 5 right now. So it's predominantly medical device EUAs at this point. All right, so just a little bit about preparing and submitting EUA requests. Again, not all products will require you to actually submit an EUA request. Some of them are kind of EUA request lights, I would say, and some of them FDA will want, a larger amount of data and information. But just wanted to point out that if you're thinking about doing an EUA, FDA will always encourage you to submit a pre-EUA before you actually submit your EUA request. This is a great opportunity to get feedback from them, introduce your company, really build confidence that you know what you're doing, and share a little bit about the technology and ask them, if they have guidance that they can provide you, if they have a template. We've found that they've been able to provide good guidance on, what they'd be looking for a new therapy that doesn't have any current EUAs. So I would really encourage you, if you're thinking about submitting an EUA, to do the pre-EUA request, and you can do that, as early as you have, solid information in place. We've seen a lot of companies use it for the validation testing requirements. So getting a sense from FDA on how much validation testing they would need, or what type of labeling, or how it can be used. So it's a good way to, kind of like a pre-sub process. It's a good way to get feedback before you submit the EUA request. And I really think it kind of builds that relationship with the FDA reviewers, because there's a special EUA reviewer team. So it's a good way to build rapport with that team as well. So just some tips, always check to see if FDA has a template to use, because they will definitely want you to use the template if there is an applicable template. And FDA has been requiring the Form 3514, which is the cover letter for some EUA submissions. So I think it would be a good idea to ask if they need that, or you can just do it. It hasn't been for all of them, but just wanted to point out that has been kind of a requirement that's come up lately. Be sure to write, treat it like a submission. You want to write clearly and accurately. It should be well organized. Treat it really like a typical, pre-market submission. Have introductory, an executive summary, have a table of contents. Make sure it's well written. It's easy for somebody to understand. It's important to write for your audience. So making it clear and concise, but also, adequately conveying the technological characteristics of your product. And I can't stress this enough, but make sure you're following FDA's instructions. If you submit a pre-EUA and they send you kind of a list of things to do or who to contact, make sure you are following that, because FDA is incredibly busy. They are getting slammed with requests, and it will help you and help your reviewer if you're just following what their instructions and their guidance on how they want the data presented. A lot of it's formatting, having the 3514 cover letter, providing information in a certain format. So I just want to stress that. If you do have questions, and we found that FDA actually has been pretty responsive to simple questions that we have, but make sure you're contacting the right email address at FDA. If you look, there's a bunch of COVID-19 email addresses that have been, like email boxes, I should say, that have been set up, like ones for hand sanitizers and surgical masks and diagnostic tests. So make sure that if you are sending a question, that first of all, it's simple, concise, to the point, not rambling, but that you're sending it to the right group. And then if you don't hear back, follow up politely. They've been really good about providing general information, but of course they're not going to be able to provide you legal advice, and they're not going to tell you, how they would classify or regulate your product. They're going to basically tell you to submit a pre-EUA or a pre-sub. But just wanted to point that out because we found them to be quite responsive and really collaborative, which is great.
Amanda, we actually already have 2 questions on EUAs.
Oh, all right. Yeah, go ahead.
So one participant would like to know, does an EUA remove the requirement for medical oversight when conducting COVID-19 testing?
So the question is, does the EUA remove the requirement for medical oversight?
When conducting COVID-19 testing, yes, exactly.
Yeah, so I think it would depend on, this particular product. It's hard to tell. I mean, I'm not aware of any like blanket requirement to remove medical oversight on testing. I can't speak to that. But each EUA, the FDA will have certain conditions or conditions of authorization that they will spell out for you. So if that's something that the company or the applicant would be interested in, I would recommend that they clarify that with the FDA for the particular product. And the type of testing that they'd be doing. But I'm not aware of a blanket, at least not under the EUA process.
Great, thank you. And the other question would be, can an EUA be a stepping stone to FDA approval?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And we are going to talk about that a little bit. So if I could just pause that, because I will, I think the next couple slides get into that. But yes, it will. It is spoiler alert, yes, it's a good stepping stone to get it to submitting a 510K or a PMA. Okay, just briefly, we'll talk about kind of the review process after you submit an EUA request. One of the really kind of important things and kind of unpredictable things is the review timeline. So FDA is not committing to any specific dates for reviewing and authorizing or even getting back to you. So, just know that going into it. At the beginning of the pandemic, I'll say we found them to be very responsive. We got responses in days, hours in some cases. Now we're noticing that their workload has increased drastically, understandably. They are pressed for time and resources. So we've seen the timelines get a little longer. So just kind of know that up front, they're working as hard as they can to expedite and make sure these products are available for our healthcare professionals, especially like PPE. But just know that, there isn't a standard timeline. So it can be extended or longer than kind of you think it should be, which is just something you have to know going into it. And there are agency priorities kind of underlying all of this. I'm not going to go into political stuff today. We have enough of that on the news. But just know that, you know, there are some political undertones in some of the policies. You know, China has been restricted from the surgical mask EUA and the non-NIOSH approved respirators. So just kind of know that the priorities are not just political, but of course, like they're going to prioritize things that are not novel. So if, like, for example, a face mask that has, you know, a novel or unique technological aspect to it, we've been told that they're not going to be prioritizing those types of products, because really under the EUA process, they're trying to get, you know, quick review, get good quality products out. They're not looking for innovation really right now under the EUA process. Yep, if you get questions from FDA, if they call you, which they have been doing, which is awesome. I love getting on the phone with them and, you know, being able to have a conversation. Make sure you're getting back to them quickly as you can, at least. If you don't know the question, the answer to the question, look into it diligently and get back to them. Just stay in touch. A lot of the times we've found that you submit an EUA request, you don't hear back for a while. After you get the acknowledgement, I would encourage you to check in. So check back, ask for the name of the lead reviewer assigned, and just kind of, you know, of course, courteously and professionally, but just check in and kind of stay on top of things. And if you're authorized, this is kind of what I mentioned in response to the question, but FDA will issue a letter of authorization, and that will list out all the conditions that you either do have to comply with or that are kind of waived or exempted. And Bryn is going to talk a little bit about the quality system piece, because that is relevant in some of these LOAs. So at some point, hopefully not in the too distant future, the EUA declaration will end. So when the public health emergency is terminated, all EUAs issued under the declaration will also end. It's important to know that FDA can also revoke or change any of the EUAs at any time. The hydroxychloroquine is a good example of that. If they, you know, find new information that changes their assessment from like a risk-benefit perspective, or if maybe another product comes on the market or is approved, or there's no longer supply shortages, they can change it. So we don't know when the EUA declaration is going to end. I think it's kind of anybody's guess right now, depending on how the COVID-19 goes over the next, you know, 6 months or so. We do know that they will provide us advance notice sufficient for the disposition of product and labeling. We don't know what that means exactly, but at least we know that we'll be getting some notice that the declaration is going to be ending soon, and hopefully have a plan for, you know, what to do with all the product that's in distribution. And then also just wanted to notice that, or to point out that products that are legally marketed under the typical regulations, so if you have a product that you are going to seek or get FDA clearance for, and you're meeting all the, you know, typical regulations that apply in a non-COVID world, you will not be impacted by, you know, the EUA declaration terminating. So this goes to the question, the second question. So we really recommend, kind of, if you're selling or thinking about selling under an EUA, you know, definitely early on, start thinking about whether you want to permanently sell, you know, as a medical device manufacturer, as a pharmaceutical manufacturer, because that will really kind of dictate your planning. And then if you do choose to pursue that, it's a good idea to start doing that in parallel, because if you know, wait until the declaration ends, then you're going to have a disruption in your business if you're not able to sell under an approved or cleared FDA approval or clearance. So just a note that you want to kind of think about that early on in the process and keep that as a you know, constant thing, and even doing projects in parallel. We see a lot of companies doing that. They'll be selling under the EUA, or, you know, working towards selling under the EUA, but then in parallel also, you know, putting a quality management system in place and really working to build out that submission so that they are going to minimize disruptions. All right, so talked a little bit about this at the beginning. FDA has been very busy since March, issuing guidance documents in addition to the EUAs. So you can imagine the amount of like writing is going on there. And there's probably just whole teams dedicated to reviewing guidance documents, you know, making sure that they're current and, you know, make sense. So they've issued at least 64 policies and guidance documents that really are intended to support COVID-19 response efforts. They were immediately implemented without prior comments, so you didn't have the industry and the public didn't have a chance to comment on them like they typically would, but you can submit comments. So there's two kind of types that we've seen: enforcement policies and temporary policies, but really they both kind of expand availability of products to address the public health emergency, and they're waiving many requirements that are in place in a typical non-COVID world. They're exercising enforcement discretion when certain conditions are met. So I think FDA has done a really good job of scoping out kind of their risk, the higher risk, the lower risk devices, and quickly coming up with a quasi-regulatory strategy to kind of figure out how much review these products need. Face masks that are not intended for liquid barrier protection are going to be a much lower risk category than a ventilator, for example. So they've done a good job, I think. Under the circumstances, they've been quite busy, and I think they've done a good job of trying to lay all these out and in a practical manner so that we are actually getting good quality products out there. So these guidance documents lay out conditions, it's labeling, it's performance requirements. You have to fully meet the requirements in order to sell under them. And just like the EUAs, they'll terminate as soon as the public health emergency ends. This is just a list of kind of some of the enforcement policies and temporary policies. There's over 36 of these. So they are product specific or product category specific. So you can kind of see just what FDA has identified as a product category that is, helps to combat COVID-19 or is assistance in other ways. Like, for example, you see the remote monitoring on here. So people aren't gonna, we have immune suppressed people or elderly people that aren't gonna be going into healthcare facilities. So they've seen a need to kind of give some flexibility on that remote monitoring piece. There's hand sanitizer gowns, sterilizers. I won't read all these, but you can go on FDA's website, and I will encourage you to do that. They have a COVID-19 kind of data or center on their website, and it's really helpful. They post daily updates, daily roundups, I think they call them. And so you can, I would encourage you to go on there, check, daily, because it does change daily. And they talk about enforcement pathway or enforcement trends, new guidance documents, changes to EUA templates. It's a really great place to stay up to date with kind of everything that's changing. And so we talked about a little bit about kind of the patchwork of documents that have been issued, but just wanted to illustrate a little bit. It's really important to know which paths are available to you, because there's a lot. So if you look just at this simple example, if you are marketing a face mask, you can market under the enforcement policy, or there's an EUA, and you have to choose kind of which one you want to market under, and then you have to meet those requirements exactly. If you want to market a surgical mask, which is a step up, it's intended to provide liquid barrier protection. There's an enforcement policy that applies. There's an umbrella EUA, and then there's also 510K clearance. So you can kind of do each of these. You can do all three. You can, but it's important to kind of know which paths are available, and then kind of thinking about future business objectives. For respirators, there is a lot. There's the enforcement policy. There's 3 different EUAs, kind of an umbrella EUAs. And then, 510K clearance, there's NIOSH approval. So there's just a lot depending on the product that you want to sell and the testing and the labeling and what kind of claims you want to make about it. It's just important to understand the options and then moving forward and then thinking about business objectives at the same time. And this is just a visual showing a face covering could be regulated and distributed under so many different paths. So it could be, again, a face mask under the EUA, a surgical mask under the EUA. There's just so many different things depending on how you label it, what testing you have, the performance requirements, and then what regulatory pathway you need to meet. So just wanted to point that out. I think it's the mask space in particular that there's just so many variables. So it's important to understand those. Just a list of considerations. You guys can read this after when we send the slides out, but just so many things to think about when you're trying to figure out what path you want to take. your design, how it's regulated, the materials, where it's manufactured. We've seen that that's important to FDA. Just customer requirements, your QSR, what testing is required. Market demand is a big one. But yeah, just a list of things to consider when you're trying to figure out which path you want to take forward. All right, so talked a little bit about kind of the EUA guidance document process. I want Bryn to talk about the quality management system piece because it does come up. So Bryn, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, and my light just went off. My battery died, I guess, in the middle, right when I'm about to speak. So that's why it's a little dark here. So, so yeah, just to talk about quality management system considerations, if you want to flip to the next slide. It's not an insignificant undertaking, and we have a lot of clients that have kind of come to us as part of the EUA process who are new to medical device or pharmaceutical manufacturing and are kind of unaware of some of these requirements. They aren't required for many of the EUA pathways, and you can see there's a list of a few requirements that the FDA has kind of said they're not going to enforce as part of the emergency use authorization. There are some enforcement policies, for example, surgical gowns like we have listed there, where you still will need to have a QSR compliant quality management system in place in order to sell them even under the emergency use authorization. And then as Amanda spoke about earlier, you will need to meet all these regulatory requirements upon termination of the EUA declaration if you don't want to have kind of a disruption in service or in production. So, and then next slide. So just kind of a broad overview of the quality management system. So it's based more on the actual organization of the manufacturer and not necessarily product based. And it covers all kind of aspects of your business. And you can see there kind of all the way to management controls, equipment and facility controls, and it's not just necessarily based on manufacturing specifically. So that's kind of another thing we've had to kind of educate some clients who are kind of new to the medical device or pharmaceutical space that these quality management system is business based and not necessarily just per product, and it's separate from kind of the submission piece. Next slide. And then as Amanda kind of mentioned earlier, also as part of the considerations, even if it's not required under the EUA, we recommend that QMS be implemented as soon as and as much as possible. The whole purpose of a quality management system is to ensure that your products, have good quality, so that they're meeting the requirements. And if you implement a quality management system kind of as you're doing your EUA process or as you're kind of working under an enforcement policy, it can help if you do choose to go forward with clearance or approval in the future to ensure that you kind of have all your ducks in a row, so that when you get to that point in your process, that there's not as much extra work that you may need to do. Another big thing that we've seen, especially recently with the public health emergency, is there is a lot of kind of complicated supply chains that are happening, especially with some of the clients that have been newer to the medical device space. So it's important to choose your contract manufacturers or your suppliers carefully, because ultimately you will be responsible for what they provide you, and your company will need to have kind of a quality management system in place, as well as contract manufacturers, and that's something that needs to be considered as well. It seems like we've had a lot of clients that have also come to us and said, well, my contract manufacturer said that they have the quality system, so I don't need it. And it seems like there's a little bit of misinformation going on out there. So that's why it's important to kind of make sure that you're starting to do your supplier evaluation and moving forward with your quality management system as early as you can be. And so that's kind of the first bullet here. And then another bullet just for the quality management system in general is like I was mentioning, it covers all aspects of the business, and it's not something that can be it's not a set it and forget it type activity. So you do need to make sure that you have resources that can be dedicated to maintaining both the system and then maintaining kind of your product quality goals as well. So I think that's my last slide there. But
okay. Yeah, no, yeah, that's
Yep.
great. Yeah, we've had a lot of clients come to us that are brand new to the industry, which is awesome. It's great to see a lot of, US companies coming to help with, the PPE shortages and stuff, but it is a learning curve. And so we just want to, we don't want to underestimate the amount of work that's required and continues to be required, as
Right.
a lot of these more established medical device companies already are doing all this. But yeah, so just wanted to point that out. It's definitely not insurmountable. We are happy to help, and we're helping many companies, put a QMS in place, but just it's not as simple as, under the EUA. There's going to be a lot more kind of requirements and just efforts and resources required. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about, I don't have too much time left, but I'll talk a little bit about enforcement. So FDA had an operation or a task force that they called Operation Quack Hack, which I love the name. But essentially they were focusing since March on really cracking down on fraudulent and unproven COVID-19 products and claims being made. So they're really, FDA's goal, their role is really to protect the public health. So you can see that really in kind of how they're enforcing a lot of the regulations around COVID-19 policy or products. So they want to, they don't want customers to be taken advantage of, especially with the fear during the pandemic, exploitation, that kind of thing. So FDA and FTC are definitely reviewing websites and social media activity. So that's, noted in every warning letter that we've read. So just, want to put that out there, check your website, make sure your social media activity, make sure you're not making claims that you shouldn't be making. And to see if there are restrictions on claims, consult the EUA, because most of them do have promotional and advertising limitations, but also there's the FTC regulates false advertising. FDA and FTC share regulation for FDA regulated products. So just make sure your website doesn't have, improper, unproven claims and social media activity as well. So since March, FDA has announced recently that they identified, almost 1,200 products that they considered to be fraudulent and unproven. They were definitely going for more egregious violators at the beginning. We've kind of seen a little bit of an evolution with the warning letters. I think as of Tuesday, there was 128 warning letters that FDA has issued since March, just only related to COVID-19. So you can just imagine the amount of time and resources that are being used on, on the enforcement of COVID-19 as well. So the warning letters span, all different types of products, all different types of claims. We're beginning to see a few where a warning letter was issued because a company failed to comply with the conditions of an EUA. So that's interesting. FDA has also been reporting to virtual marketplaces, so places like Amazon, Walmart, places where, individual companies can sell their products on it and maybe make inappropriate claims. And it looks like they're also looking at the domain registrar, so websites. So for example, like www.curecovid.com, they would complain to the domain registrar that that's an inappropriate name, for example. So I kind of mentioned this already, but so if you're not meeting the conditions in your LOA, FDA deems it to be adulterated and or misbranded if it's not approved or authorized or cleared. So they can pursue warning letters. We've seen that. They can pursue seizures and injunctions. We've seen examples of injunctions, and they can seek criminal prosecution against companies that are violating the law. They've also taken, I think, multiple different product alerts. The hand sanitizer one has been kind of the most prevalent, but I'm sure you've all heard about, there was a methanol contaminated hand sanitizer, so they continue to add to the list of hand sanitizers not to use. There's been microbial contamination. There's been improper packaging. So I don't know if you guys saw, there was one that looked like a food container, like one of those little applesauce pouches for kids. It looked exactly like, it looked like a food pouch, but it had hand sanitizer in it. So there was a recent issue or safety alert on that. So just interesting to see kind of the evolution of how enforcement activity has gone. related to these COVID-19 cases. All right, almost done. Just wanted to touch quickly on the PrEP Act and the QSR Act, just because they're relevant. So the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act basically authorizes the Secretary to issue, the Secretary of DHHS to issue a declaration that actually provides immunity from liability for certain medical countermeasures. So there's those we talked about at the very beginning, products used to treat, prevent, diagnose COVID-19. So there is some immunity protection as long as your product is listed as a medical countermeasure product. The only exception is willful misconduct. So you're not going to get liability for willful misconduct. And there was a declaration for COVID-19 issued in February. And the immunity generally applies to those involved in the development, manufacture, testing, distribution, administration, and use of certain MCM. So you'll want to consult with to see what products are listed on there in the MCM list. Then the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, so the CARES Act, this was recent over the summer. It introduced new shortage notification plans. So medical product manufacturers, if they're foreseeing a shortage, there's new notification requirements, much like there are for drug shortage notifications. They added PPE to the products that have to be included in the Strategic National Stockpile. I think we've seen kind of didn't have enough, so that is understandably added. And then respiratory protective devices were added as a medical countermeasure, so an MCM that is eligible for liability under the PrEP Act. So on the previous slide. All right, so we didn't get into like in depth on product EUAs and kind of step-by-step things, but just wanted to put a few takeaways on here, and we're happy to follow up, or if you want to follow up with us after, we can, I'll put our email and phone numbers on here. But just do your homework, really stay up to date with FDA COVID-19 website is kind of the #1 thing. They post really great information and updates on the website daily. So if you're even considering selling a product under any of these EUAs or policies or guidance documents, just keep checking, stay up to date with that. Again, make sure you're considering all options available and identifying the most appropriate path for your product, whether it's an EUA, an enforcement policy, a temporary policy, maybe just clearance or approval, or maybe a little bit of both or all of them. Definitely considering the future business objectives. So after the EUA declaration is no longer in existence, do you want to establish yourself as a medical device manufacturer? And if so, then your plan and your process is going to look a little different. And kind of knowing and being aware of the time and effort required to do that. Engage FDA early on in the process, submit a pre-EUA if applicable. So, I mean, if you're going to sell it under an enforcement policy, then again, you don't need to submit an EUA. But if you're submitting an EUA, FDA would definitely recommend that you do the pre-EUA engagement. Follow FDA's instructions. Again, write clearly, organized, be professional in your interactions with the agency as always. Making sure that all your claims, so anything you're saying about your product, whether it's being sold under the EUA or not, or an enforcement policy, just making sure that all your claims, and that includes anything that your sales team says, anything posted on social media, on your website, make sure that kind of as a golden rule, they have to be accurate, not misleading, and substantiated. So, not making inaccurate claims that your product, prevents COVID or cures COVID. And we've seen that FDA has been, targeting a lot of those more egregious claims. Again, I talked about this already, but just understanding the time, effort, and resources that may be required and be prepared. And then if you don't have the expertise in-house or the resources, I really encourage you to find somebody with legal, regulatory, or quality expertise to help with this process. Bren and I have been working, in this EUA world for, since March. So we have kind of quickly become experts in a lot of these EUA processes and documents. And so we could probably save, a lot of legwork on your end if you need any assistance in that area. All right, that is all we have. I will put our phone number and email address up there. If you guys have questions, feel free to reach out to either Bryn and I. You can go on our website, gardner.law, so www.gardner.law, and we have a little bit more information about our firm and services on there as well. But thank you for taking time today, and I hope you guys have a good rest of the day or evening.
Before we continue with Kurt Wilhoft's part, there is actually one question on the PrEP Act that you discussed earlier.
Sure.
And the participant is wondering if you could explain the inclusions and exclusions for product liability.
Yeah, so they have a list of MCM products that are listed in the PrEP Act. I don't know them off the top of my head, but if you Google PrEP Act medical countermeasures, it would be in there. Otherwise, we'd be happy to look into, we could make an assessment as to whether your product is covered by that PrEP Act and how it would be covered. But I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have the list.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amanda. So now we'll continue with great. So now we'll continue with Kurt's part. Let me just switch the presenter. So let's see it from the EU perspective.
Yes.
Aya, can you confirm that my screen is now shared and you can see my slides?
Yes, but it appears that you're showing 2 screens. So maybe you can try to share just one screen. Perfect.
Great.
Good.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to take over now from Minneapolis here in Munich. It's already evening in Munich, as you might see partly here on the window. It's nearly 7 o'clock. And I'm changing now from FDA to notified bodies and the emergency use authorization to the EU medical device regulation, a topic which kept the medtech world here, at least in Europe, very, very active in the last months. And I know from experience also a lot of medtech companies, medical device manufacturers in the USA. I would like to provide you with a list of action items which might help you to become MDR compliant within the remaining 7 months. You might all know that finally the EU medical device regulation will enter into force and become valid from May 2021 on. Based on our experience, here you see a checklist of the most relevant, I will not say urgent because still 7 months are remaining, but very relevant and important to-dos that you have to consider in the next months if you haven't done already. I will start nevertheless with a very brief overview about the current regulatory regime and also with a background why the European legislator has decided for a more or much stricter regulatory framework for medical devices here in Europe, hopefully in order to increase your understanding of the following points, the to-do items, and then I will conclude with a very brief view on the UK market. Brexit is very close, and if you are placing your products on the UK market, there are a few items or a few actions that need to be considered if you want to continue to place your product on the UK market also in 2021. The current regulatory regime, very brief overview. Most of you might know this. We are currently having 3 directives depending on the nature, the applicability depending on the nature of the products, directives and also Commission guidelines. The Commission guidelines are not legally binding, just guidelines, as the name already says, and directives from year 1990, 93 and 98, quite old, and most of you might know a directive is not directly applicable in the member states. It is required that they are transformed, implemented into national law, that they are directly applicable, which also needs a bit of discretion for the respective member states, how they implement these requirements. So we have not no full harmonization for the time being. We also, just to remind you, we also have no full harmonization when it comes to interactions between medical device manufacturers and healthcare professionals and patient organizations. Also no full harmonization regarding product-related advertisement and regarding market access in terms of pricing and reimbursement. This will now change after the medical device regulation will become effective, because we are in the favorable position that a medical device regulation is directly applicable, and this is a convenient position for medical device manufacturers which act internationally, because at least for the European Union there's only one regulation, only one law applicable, so we have an identical regulatory framework in all 27 member states. Very briefly to the background, why has the European legislator decided to increase the regulatory obligations for all economic operators? First of all, as you recall, the directives are quite old, dating from 1990, 1993 and 1998. So already in 2003 and in 2009, the Commission initiated a so-called MDD recast. But the relevant and crucial starting point was the so-called PIP scandal. Most of you might know that was a French manufacturer which used industrial silicon for breast implants instead of clinically tested silicone. And that was discovered by the responsible authorities in 2010, and this was the final motivation and the initial starting point for the MDR. It's still needed from the disclosure of the PIP scandal, March 2010, until the MDR, the medical device regulation, entered into force in 2017, or at least was published in the European Journal. I believe the main reason for that was the huge extent the medical device regulation has in comparison to the currently applicable medical device directive. To compare the numbers, you can see the medical device directive has 23 articles and 10 annexes. The MDR has 123 articles and 17 annexes. This very briefly on the background on the EU medical device regulation. As I said, it has been published in the European Journal beginning of May 2017. And the regulation is that it then enters into force 20 days after its publication. So the initial or the planned date of effective date was 26 May 2017. And also COVID-19 had its impact on that. The European Commission and the European Parliament decided end of April this year that all the relevant stakeholders and parties in the healthcare systems in the respective member states should focus on the COVID-19 pandemic and should not worry or should not use their resources for the implementation of the MDR. So they have postponed the final date of validity from May 2020 to the 26th of May 2021, which still gives us 6 to 7 months
to work on MDR compliance if you are affected, if you are an economic operator, if you are a manufacturer, if you are an authorized representative, an importer or a distributor. So now to the to-do list based on our experience. First of all, of course, the basis for placing your product on the market is your CE certificate. You have to check how long this is still valid. The MDR applies from May 2021 on, but it grants a transitional period, a grace period, and says devices that only have a declaration of conformity based on the current MDD can still be placed on the market until this declaration of conformity expired. So as you all know, to give you an example, if you have done your recertification under the MDD and finished this successfully in 2018, then you can place your product on the market under this MDD certificate for the 5 years. The CE certificate, the declaration of conformity, is usually valid. There is, however, a fixed deadline, and when this expired, this grace period, this is May 2024. Also important to keep in mind, there is a kind of sell-off period granted by the European legislator, saying so that when you have placed your medical device lawfully on the market before 26th of May 2021, you are still, or the product can still be made available or put into service until May 2025. This means if your MDD CE certificate expires, for instance, in April 2021, you are allowed to sell it to a distributor. So you place it by selling it to a distributor on the EU market, and the distributor then can still resell it or to another distributor or to the customer or to the user until May 2025. So first to do that I very much recommend is check the validity period of your CE certificate. The second is check your notified body. You know the difference between the US and the European Union. You have the FDA, which grants 510K approvals, marketing authorization from a public body. We have notified bodies, which are legal persons under private law. So we have TUV, for instance, we have DECRA, we have BSI, and TUV, for instance, is a GmbH. So it's a legal person. And this legal person obtains a notification that it may carry out this conformity assessment procedures, upon which the CE mark can then be granted. All this is done on basis of a cooperation agreement. So we are in a position where we have notified bodies, and we could see the phenomenon, or we call it orphaned manufacturers, because we have a dying of notified bodies, at least in the last decade. When you see or you compare the numbers from 2010, there were 80 plus notified bodies existent in the European Union. In 2013, it was only, the number were only 58, and in 2019. Remaining with an MDD certification. That means this notified body has the power to do or to grant a CE certificate, a declaration of conformity under the Medical Device Directive. We still have 39 notified bodies. You all know the Medical Device Regulation increases the regulatory obligation not only for the economic operators but also for the notified bodies. So for small or mid-sized notified body, it can be or could be very challenging to obtain this MDR accreditation or notification. And you can see this also when you have a look on the NANDO database, which is a database that's provided by the European Commission. We currently only have a number of 70 notified bodies which were able to obtain an MDR accreditation. So it's very interesting to see if you are in danger to be one of these orphaned manufacturers, because when you lose your orphaned manufacturer, then also the quality management system and also the declaration of conformity will become invalid. So this is a very important point. First, check the period of validity for your CE mark, and also how long is your notified body authorized to act as a notified body. The second or the third to do I would recommend is check your scientific data. Medical device manufacturers under the MDD regime, under the current regime, are in the comfortable position that when they show, or when they have to show, when they have to prove conformity with the medical device directive, the medical device directive mainly rules out or requires safety data. We now have a change in this, and I've quoted here on my slide Article 5, where you can see in Section 1, a device may be placed on the market if it complies with this regulation. So this is still the same if it complies with the directive or with this regulation. And the so evidence of showing conformity or compliance with this regulation, this is new, and this is scheduled and ruled out, set out in Section 3. Demonstration of conformity now requires also performance data. Performance data needs to be shown by clinical evaluation. You see here in the legal definition of a clinical evaluation, this also requires clinical benefit, and clinical benefit in itself also means the positive impact of a device on the health of an individual. So this is new, where currently, at present and in the past, medical device manufacturers have only been asked to provide safety data to prove conformity with the medical device directive. In the future, also clinical benefits, and meaning positive impact of a device on the health of individual when it's used in the intended purpose. So our recommendation is to engage at a very early stage with your notified body and to discuss with them what kind of scientific data, efficacy data they will require to when they review the conformity of your device with the medical device regulation. Our next recommended to do is check the risk class, because you can see that mainly 4 groups of medical devices are subject to an upgrade. These are mainly implantable medical devices, software and medical devices consisting of nanomaterials, as well as medical devices composed of substances which are intended to be introduced into the human body. They all receive an upgrade. For instance, software, mainly class 1 for the time being, is upgraded to class 2-3. This is if you are placing a product on the market or manufacturing software as a medical device, and which is currently class 1, you have to be aware that most likely it will be considered as class 2A in the future. And this requires the upgrade from class 1 to class 2A, that when you do a conformity assessment procedure, it is mandatory to also involve and engage with a notified body. This is very important when you have in mind that currently only the big players as BSI, TÜV and DEKRA, just to give you some names, are currently able to do also an MDR accreditation because they already have obtained the notification under the MDR. The next recommended to do is employ a person responsible for regulatory compliance. To give you background on this, we currently have, at least here in Germany and in Austria, the requirement for manufacturers, if they have their registered place of business in Germany or Austria, to provide for a so-called safety officer, safety inspector. This example is now rolled out EU-wide because the MDR imposes on manufacturers to provide for a PRRC, person responsible for regulatory compliance, with a respective qualification. Here you see a catalog of responsibilities of the person responsible for regulatory compliance. And some of the audience is listening from the US. If you're a manufacturer with a permanent place of business in the US, then you have to make sure that your authorized representative is having such person responsible for regulatory compliance at hand, either employed, or if you or your authorized representative is a small or mid-sized entity, then you are allowed to outsource this function. Now, this is something that's a position that you have to fulfill or you have to employ from May 2021 on. Very time intensive. Check the MDR compliance of your distribution chain. We have various economic operators, in particular, if you are a manufacturer that is located in a third country, then we have the manufacturer. You are required to have an authorized representative if you are located and manufacturing in a third country. And you are having, by nature, an importer into the European Union. And you might have, if they sell to another distributor, also a distributor. Identify in your distribution chain which function, which party fulfills which function. This might sound easy with respect to manufacturer and authorized representative, but it can become very tricky and complicated with respect to the importer and distributor. Once you have done this due diligence, I give you some or a list of regulatory obligations which, for instance, the importer has to fulfill. You see the bullet points here. Verify MDR compliance of supplied devices. This might seem very easy, just to check the declaration of conformity, check the labeling of the device. But what becomes burdensome in our experience and requires a lot of negotiations with your importer or your distributor, because it has the distributor has the same regulatory obligation to establish a register of complaints. This is something that can be quite burdensome. Verify order made registration, comply with device-specific storage and transport conditions. So this is something that the MDR imposes on distributors and also to importers according to Article 13 and according to Article 30. The best practice and absolute 100% common practice is to include these regulatory obligations also in your intercompany or your distribution agreements. So keep in mind that this can be very time consuming when negotiating either new distribution or import agreements or distributor agreements. Also a point very often necessary to take this action is when you are a manufacturer based with a registered place of business in a third country, you are required to have an authorized representative with a permanent place of business in the European Union. Now it's required by the medical device regulation that this mandate for the authorized representative is stipulated in writing. So you need a cooperation agreement with your authorized representative, which is not always the case, and most likely, or for some manufacturers based in third countries, another action item on their to-do list. My last point, which I would like to emphasize and to draw your attention to, is when you are supplying your products also to the UK. You all know that the Brexit will become effective from January 2021 on. So this makes the UK to a third country, and the European Medical Device Regulation will not be applicable anymore in the UK. So there are certain things that you have to take into consideration. First, positive. The UK, according to the MHRA guidance issued beginning of September, is willing to recognize the CE mark until June 2023. This is quite positive. From that date on, from 20th June 2023 on, a so-called UK CA mark is required, CA for conformity assessed. So you can use your CE mark under MDD or MDR until mid-2023, then so-called UK CE mark is required. What you also have to do is you have to register your products before placing them on the UK market to the MHRA. There are certain transitional periods and grace periods applicable depending on the risk class. So either 4, 8, or 12 months delay is allowed with this registration process. In any case, what you need, you have to appoint a UK responsible person. If you are a manufacturer with a registered place of business outside the UK, there is the disadvantage that certainly the UK responsible person needs to have an establishment or a registered place of business in the UK. So keep this in mind. CE mark still valid until June 2023. You have to register your product. Certain grace periods, transitional periods apply, but what you already most likely need to take care of now, if you want to continue to place your product on the UK market, take actions, engage with maybe third-party providers that they serve as UK responsible person if you want to continue to place your product on the UK market. It's a very dynamic legal field, certainly Brexit, but we were at least quite happy that the MHRA issued some guidance. You can see that and read this on the link that I provided, which is quite helpful. And yeah, these were my action items in view of the MDR. We still have 7 months until May 2021. And have in mind that the Brexit is very close. So if you are also serving and supplying the UK market, there are also might be some outstanding action items for your company. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that was helpful and interesting, and happy to hear if there were some questions from the audience.
Well, so far there are no questions, but of course, if any more questions come up after the webinar, which is often the case, don't hesitate to contact any of us. I think we'll wait a little bit longer, and meanwhile, I just want to remind you that this is a 4-part webinar series. This is part 2, and in exactly 2 weeks, Cord Willheft and Mark Gardner will talk about healthcare compliance update. Okay, so far I don't see any more questions. Well, of course, you'll be sent the presentation afterwards, and as this webinar has been recorded, the panelists will also send you the link to the video.
Great. Thank you.
Lovely.
Thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day,
Yeah.
and the evening.
Great. Thank you all for attending, and also thanks to the speakers, of course, for their great presentation.
Thank you.
All right. So have a great rest of the week, and thank you.